we can just give our own introductions. We've got Kumar Garg, Jordan Dworkin, and Bishaka Mona. Could you guys tell me what first got you excited about philanthropy? And then what's the most exciting thing currently happening in philanthropy?
Sure. Well, awesome. Thank you for having me. It's really exciting to hear all the conversations and excited to talk to you all. So I'm Jordan Dworkin. I work at Coefficient Giving, which was formerly known as Open Philanthropy up until about 2 weeks ago. So we are a kind of philanthropic funder and advisor. We work across a lot of domain areas with the kind of common theme of finding important, neglected, and tractable areas that are kind of high potential leverage being ignored to some extent by the philanthropic community, but where we see opportunities to make significant progress. And one of those areas that I work on is innovation policy and meta-science. And so we fund not science directly in my portfolio, but fund efforts like research hubs to make science more effective, more efficient, more innovative. So what got me excited about philanthropy? I've worked in science for a while. I was a biostatistician doing medical research, neuroimaging, I think like Tyler. I jumped ship to do policy for a couple of years and just got excited about thinking about making science better from a bunch of different vantage points, and always respected Open Philanthropy's work at the time and saw an opportunity to do really creative things to try to make the ecosystem more ambitious and experimental. And I think on the experimental point, the thing I'm excited about in philanthropic funding and science funding in general is what I see as kind of a proliferation of experimentation in how we fund science. I think the past few decades have been characterized by kind of a follow-on of an expert panel consensus review process as the gold standard across a lot of different scientific ecosystems. And I think the past few years and the next few decades, hopefully, we'll see more of kind of a Cambrian explosion of trying to fund science in different ways, learn about what those ways do and do not do effectively, and then scaling them in the areas where they can be most effective.
Hi, everybody. Kumar Garg. My journey to philanthropy was I served in the Obama administration, worked for President Obama's science advisor, did that job for almost 8 years, and got to sort of see the scientific enterprise at the funding level, but at the kind of policy level. So everything from DARPA to NIH to NSF, how do we actually want to sort of run the enterprise, set priorities? After that, I worked with Eric Schmidt on his Science and Tech Foundation, and we did a lot of both direct grant making, but then a lot of experimentation around different ways of establishing scientific organizations, whether it's organizations like Convergent Research and the FRO model and other things. And then most recently, I created an organization called Renaissance Philanthropy with the real goal of helping more donors come off the sidelines and bet big on science and tech. And I think this is like a heady time on where science funding should go. So very timely conversation. Great to be here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Bishaka Mona. I'm an associate advisor at Science Philanthropy Alliance. The Alliance is a network of individual philanthropists and foundations who want to fund science or have been funding science. And we advise them on their funding, everything from setting up a foundation to finding the right partners to fund with. And I was introduced to philanthropy in my graduate school. I was volunteering for fundraising groups and just realized how important philanthropy is through those events, and then moved on to Science Philanthropy Alliance, where I have been here since. In the recent times, what I've learned is philanthropy has played a major role in science, but this year, there's a current moment where philanthropy is called upon to play a bigger role. And many funders are thinking about how to do that in a more sustainable format, not just funding projects, but funding people, funding infrastructure. And I'm really excited to see that movement in philanthropy.
Awesome. Thank you all. So one of the things that's always struck me is the replication crisis, where folks have estimated that between 50 to 85% of all experiments can't be independently replicated. This to me, seems like a big drain on kind of funders' investments into science. I guess I'm curious, how do you all see the funders' role when it comes to actually incentivizing good science?
In general, I think this is a pretty good topic. Generally, the incentives for individual researchers to focus on replication are small, right? That's not where most career advancement happens. So the built-in incentives to just say, this is where I'm going to do my next bit of research is low. The societal benefits of replication are high, partly because of what you're saying, which is some things don't replicate. The second is replication is also very valuable because often things that do replicate then build a lot of policy momentum on top of them. So there's like, anytime you have individual benefits are low for a researcher, but broader public benefits are high, policy should usually step in. Like there should be built-in research funding for replications. I think the political question right now is like replication is being brought up in a very, like maybe there's a pox on the science house and maybe all science does not replicate. This is even amidst like we're having huge discoveries, right? Like whether it's GLP-1s, whether it's all these other things. So I think we have to hold both things in our heads at the same time, which is the US scientific system generates an immense amount of discoveries and creates a huge return on dollar, but they're also everything from, as you know, Stuart has documented, things that border on scientific fraud to just, scientific outputs that are structured in a way where they're very hard to actually verify. So how do we actually want to build a system where we're incentivizing replication and we're also creating scientific outputs that actually other folks can build upon?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Kumar said, and I'll talk about a few different models that one could take to incentivizing replication, because I think they're all potentially even represented in this room. So I think a policy angle and an angle that a lot of philanthropic funders take is kind of either requiring or financially incentivizing the kinds of practices that might make science more reproducible. There are philanthropic funders that are increasingly requiring open science practices, open data, open code. I think the empirical evidence on whether those things improve replicability is still forthcoming, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe that it could. The other angle is that, as Kumar said, there is not a lot of incentive in the ecosystem for people to do this as part of their scientific work. And I think you can find ways to just get people who are excited about this to do it more sustainably. There aren't a lot of ways for those people to get the resources, to get the support socially and financially to do that, even if they are really excited about replication as like a contribution that they can make to the field. And I think increasingly there are efforts to make that more feasible and sustainable. So we have supported the Institute for Replication for a couple of years. They're an effort specifically in economics and social science and increasingly kind of computational public health research. But they've created a model where basically they create this community of people who are excited about replication, and they give them support and community and events in which to make that a key feature of their own contribution to the scientific ecosystem. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I would say I agree with Kumar and the different examples of how replication is being supported and also people, the incentive structure is not there. I think we talked about this in the earlier morning discussion. I think funders are trying to change that incentive system. However, philanthropy alone cannot do that. So we need policy changes as well. And there's a lot of discussion around what are the systems that needs to be built to increase replication, duplication, and also publishing of the negative data, so to say. So openness and transparency in the research infrastructure is needed, and there are different funding models out there that help support that.
Yeah, one of the things I've been most inspired by with scientific funders over the past couple of years is kind of like mandating open science practices as part of receiving the funding. So like Gates Foundation, CZI, Wellcome Trust recently requiring preprints. Even the US government with the Nelson Memo requiring open access and open data. That to me is incredibly promising. I guess I'm curious, you guys all live in the funding world. Are there any other kind of potential requirements that funders could tie to grant giving that could increase the quality of the science? For instance, like requiring pre-registration maybe or something like that. But curious if you all have heard of any funders thinking, progressively about that, just because in general, CZI, Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, trying these things like requiring open science as part of the grant seems pretty effective.
Yeah, I think requiring open science has been helpful, but one of the things that has also helped more is providing that support to do open science. One example I will share is Sergey Brin's ASAP initiative. They provide team science funding, and one of the team members is a data scientist by training that helps make the data that's produced in the labs openly accessible. So you need someone with the training, like computer science training, which traditionally not all scientists have, to make the data openly accessible, upload it to the platform, and coordinate between the different teams. So that has always helped those particular grants to accelerate and easily make the data open. So providing that implementation support also helps, besides just making it open science.
So I think there are a number of different sort of streams that are happening, and they all intersect, and everyone uses the word open. So one is there's been just a huge policy fight. I mean, folks who don't follow this work don't track it, but there's just a huge policy fight around academic journals. So when I was in the government, this was just like a very big sore point, which is there is a very active view that, you know, academic journals are basically profit taking on top of a lot of federal research, and that they are, you know, their incentives are structured in a certain way, but that also that these are very valuable commercial enterprises, and the researchers are providing a lot of the value, but they're not creating a lot of value capture. That debate has gone a long way. So both during COVID, the rise of preprints, a lot of the social infrastructure, the infrastructure around open access has really gone. And then the Nelson memo is actually like a step ladder of work that both happened first in the philanthropic community to require this for PIs, but then has really sort of stepped up. And so Greg is here from the Open Research Funders Group and others who have worked on this for many years. I think there's like a parallel effort that is actually thinking about kind of scientific output and scientific instruments, scientific data, you know, some of the work that CZI and Wellcome have done on like open scientific software. That's actually more around like what is the actual, like, what is it that we are actually outputting into the world? The journal is like one type of output, but actually in this world of AI, like what should scientific output look like is like a big open question. Who eats it? What does it go into? So I think those are, sometimes people meld these two conversations, which they can be, but there's, you know, and those are two different questions around what are you trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve for, you know, all the feelings people have about journals and the incentives that creates on researchers around trying to get in the journals and the incentive models? And then there's also this question around what is the output that researchers are creating day to day? And is it an output that is relevant in this age in which increasingly models are going to read their output?
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I'll flag one additional interesting approach that is kind of a reverse mandate, which is happening at the Astera Institute, and I think Prachi is in the audience, which was essentially disallowing their grantees from publishing in traditional journals, which I think is fascinating, though I haven't implemented it myself, in that it's both a selection mechanism. You're finding people who care so much about answering the actual scientific questions that they're willing to forego a potential, though not proven, kind of career risk that they can't get that paper somewhere very prestigious. And you are also encouraging them to be creative about how they are going to communicate that science. And so it's both a push and a selection, and I think I'm really excited to see how it works out. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess my next question is if you could wave a magic wand and fix one aspect of scientific publishing, what would it be?
Scientific publishing?
Or scientific funding, sorry.
So I don't think I've been in this space long enough to have high confidence that my spell will like be directionally and magnitudinally correct. So the thing I would actually probably do is make all of science funding data publicly available, potentially with some embargo, to set loose people like Heidi Williams and Pierre Azoulay, who are fantastic economists of science, on kind of our past 100 years of funding science in different ways, in different ecosystems, in different fields, and just learn about what has worked where, what is no longer fit for purpose, what are the new models that are coming on actually show. And I think that just our understanding of how we fund science is limited by the fact that the kind of meta data on funding science is itself kind of cut at the level of who did receive funding, and we are unable to really learn the way that we might otherwise be able to.
Yeah, I think one of my sort of observations, so meta science is like this emerging discipline of the science of science or testing different ideas, has been kind of in the ether now for actually quite some time. I think the gap I constantly see is most of the money is government money. And we have not developed good systems for government to actually take some of these ideas and go from 0 to 1. So I remember having this conversation with Tyler Cowan after he did his Patrick Collison and Fast Grants program, where they did this like really nice video about fast grants, and they had this really interesting experiment where they asked researchers, if you magic wand waived all your requirements, would you change your research? And 50% said yes, which is a real problem, right? Because like the research community runs the research process. So if the research community both runs the research process and says we would change our research if we had the right, like what are we doing here, right? But what was interesting was I asked Tyler, I was like, so Tyler, what are you doing to have the government implement fast grants? And he was like, I'm like off to my next thing, And I was like, well, that's like the question, right? And if you go meet with NSF and NIH, they'll say, we have fast grants. They'll say, oh, we have this program, and that can allow, and we have this program. And so you have to then dig and say, well, what about that program that you have on the books didn't really cause very fast funding to happen during COVID? And I actually think the big opportunity, I mean, we're doing this a lot with Renaissance, is we'll take some of these ideas and we'll say, what would it take to actually build a program that actually, trains people to be DARPA program officers so that more research agencies can actually hire them. And then we'll run the program and then we'll offer to the government. Often they will then say, yeah, we want that, and we'll take it in. So I think that like we just have to be much more intentional when people say something should exist, to not say that's someone else's problem. Like it is incumbent on this room. That's why I think meetings like this are really useful. What makes ResearchHub interesting is that it exists. Like it is doing a bunch of active work. It was learning a bunch of interesting insights, and so then my question would be is like, has the ResearchHub team then gone and presented to the agencies and dealt with all their annoying questions around why we can't do it this way? And then, because the US government spends $200 billion on research. That's the big opportunity space. And so we have to do the work of convincing them to move it along.
Yeah, I'll build off of Kumar's point. Like, I think if I had a magic wand, I'll probably help, and we are moving towards it, like have more coordination among funding from industry, government, philanthropy. All of these sectors need to come together, and research cannot happen without one of these sectors. All of them play really important roles. And right now, that system is fragmented, and we have seen the result of the fragmented system, especially in the data infrastructure aspect. Like, we saw that many of the data sets were stopped being funded from the government, and then researchers were not sure how to access them. And as a result, the research suffered. Scientific enterprise came to a halt because of this. If industry and philanthropy were all partnered together, then we can have a more decentralized system that is more sustainable in the long term. An example of that I can share is Gates Ventures has launched a program on Alzheimer's disease data initiative that brings together the data infrastructure. They have industry collaborations that bring in clinical trial data from industry. And we know industry doesn't really like sharing the data, but they have negotiated what type of data, not the full data, but at least some analysis to be shared openly on their platform that allows researchers to access that data and then do research on that data. So we need such collaborations, more and more of such collaborations to help accelerate science.
That's super cool. Thank you. Kumar, you brought up fast grants, which is a huge inspiration for us personally. We saw fast grants happen, saw the 5-paragraph Google form. We're like, oh, whoa, this is basically a pre-registration. Like, you can use pre-registrations to fund research effectively. So totally agree on like the experimentation in funding being like a good idea in general, just to see what works and what doesn't work. One thing I've been kind of confused about is like innovation and like trying new ways of funding doesn't really seem to be tied to like the size of an organization. So like individuals will try cool things like the Collisons and Fast Grants, right? You've got like nonprofits like DMT Quest who are willing to try something new with us. But then even like the US government, like they funded replication markets, with DARPA. So just curious in general, like who's leading the innovation when it comes to scientific funding, or is it just everybody's trying everything? Or curious, where does the innovation come from?
Yeah, here's what I would say, which is that there's actually no actual barrier to the government doing any of these things. It's not like there's a law that like, oh, the reason why NSF or NIH can't do this is because of this thing, that we need to tell Congress that they need this authority. This is just a huge amount of practice and habits and sort of like bordering on self-justification. Like, hey, this is the way we're doing it. Money's going out the door. Good stuff is getting funded. Like leave me alone, right? And so you have to show up with like a reason as to why something different is going to create different answers, right? So the argument for, so one of the big things happened in the last administration was the creation of ARPA-H, right, as a new agency, like an ARPA for health. The impetus for why Congress went along with that, to create that new agency, was that it said, NIH for 20 years had said, we have these centers of innovation, and that's where like cutting edge biomedical work would happen. And people would be like, that's not true. Like you're just funding really good PIs. They're doing their next grant. They're not pushing on all these things that are important. And like eventually what made NIH actually listen was like the competitive threat of them saying, we're going to create a new agency and give them, and then suddenly NIH was like, no, we can do, like during COVID, they started doing RADx and a bunch of other stuff. So I think one of the things that is that we have to find, customers in the government, people who are interested in doing new interesting things, and actually work closely with them and actually doing these experiments. So I think, I still call it open fill. They supported work where Institute for Progress went and sat with NSF and actually designed these golden ticket awards where a single reviewer will get to be able to pick out a proposal that they really like that everyone else hates. I don't know if you guys have ever done an NSF review. I've sat through them. Like the consensus thing is real. Like someone will be like, this project is awesome, and one person will be like, this project is not awesome, and then we're like, okay, let's take that one out. Right? So like it happens all the time. So so the golden ticket was meant to solve that. And because IFP did the work of like getting themselves badged, they have like NSF badges because they need access to the all this information around the awards, and NSF doesn't want to share it because there's very clear rules around application awards. But they did all the work, so then they were able to do this research and run these things. So one of the things is, one, you have to find active customers. Two, you have to do the work of showing up. You cannot just tweet at them and be like, oh my God, like, why don't you guys do better? And three is you have to create competitive pressures. So like we have noticed, we do a lot of work in the UK. We work with ARIA, which is the big new R&D agency that they set up. What's been fascinating is we do a lot of this like what's next work with ARIA. Now, lots of other R&D agencies of the UK government have come knocking saying, what about us, right? These dynamics, these social pressures that exist among the research agencies can work to your benefit, but like you have to kind of create facts on the ground. And I just think like if we want more of these ideas to show up, like build a foothold and then say to all the other agencies, they'll come knocking and say, well, we want it too.
Totally agree with everything Kumar said, though. We'll caveat that I think not everyone would be as successful as bringing people along as you are. I think you're very unique in that sense. I want to go to bat for the agencies a tiny bit, which is that they are not really these massive lumbering institutions. They are a lot of little institutions with decision makers that have a lot of authority over small scale pieces of the organization. So I work with IFP on this partnership with NSF. And when you go to talk to program directors and staff who've been on these programs for a decade or two, a lot of them have run experiments in their programs. There were really interesting experiments kind of getting rid of the deadline for grant applications and just saying you can submit at any time And those experiments reduced burden in the agency and actually scaled across the agency to a pretty significant extent. There were other experiments that dramatically shortened the application length to like 2 pages and then had other applicants review each other's proposals. That one didn't scale, partly because the scientists themselves didn't like it. They were worried about scooping, they were worried about IP, and those were problems that were enough of a barrier that the agency didn't think it was worth kind of like really redesigning this whole effort. And so on that point, I'll also say, I think these agencies often see themselves as serving the scientific community. And if the scientific community is not bought into some radical change, I think that really raises the bar to how clear a change would have to be in its positive outcome for the agency to kind of push through that resistance and make it happen. And golden tickets is an interesting example where a lot of scientists are just like not bought into that as an idea for how to change peer review. They think it might kind of introduce more social buddy-buddy dynamics. And so you need to also convince the scientific community to go to bat for these ideas before the agencies will feel comfortable kind of putting them in place by fiat.
Awesome. So we've mentioned fast grants, golden tickets, having applicants review each other's applications, kind of cool. I guess I'm curious, like I've even heard recently, like just randomized grant giving, not even having a thought process around it could be better than what we're currently doing. It's like a thought people have. So I guess like I'm curious if you guys know any experiments that you'd like to draw attention to, like bring more awareness to, where you think it's like an innovative way to try funding new science.
I'll do 2 quick ones. One I'll let Kumar speak to more extensively if he wants to. I think the idea of these coordinated research programs that kind of look like or don't necessarily look like ARPA programs, helping scientists kind of train up in marshaling that money really effectively with more empowered decision making, I think is an incredibly cool experiment, and the excitement that's been building around it I think is really promising. One that's a little more fledgling that I'm excited about learning more is kind of peer-to-peer funding at a smaller scale. So there's an organization called the Hypothesis Fund that kind of gives people practicing science within their field resources to then go like re-grant that money to people that they know who are doing great work. And David Lang, who's in the audience, kind of thinks a lot about these kind of people at a small field building scale, kind of helping start new domains by kind of really being on the ground, seeing what's going on and seeing where kind of small-scale resources given by another kind of collaborative scientist can launch something into the stratosphere. I think building evidence for that is still a work in progress, but I think it's a really cool idea, and I think getting more information on when and how it works would be really exciting.
Yeah, part of the reason I find the like ARPA model like a powerful one, and one that we've been pushing a lot through Renaissance, has been that at some level, I think selection is just like too narrow of a lens around thinking about like where science can go, right? Like, okay, you have 100 possible proposals. What's a better way to select the top 10, right? That's interesting. But like what I find interesting about like a program officer at DARPA is like they're not selecting what are the top 10 out of 100. Often they have a theory for what is an emerging missing area where, if we brought folks from these 2 communities that don't really work together to build out this new capability, we can push. So in 2006, when DARPA pushed and said we could have autonomous driving that can drive 200 miles across the Mojave Desert and cross the finish line, it was like a mix of like early notions of autonomy and other things and saying, could we actually get over that? That winning team ends up becoming modern day Waymo, right? So there's a lot, when Dan Wattendorf shows up in 2012 and said, what if there is a pandemic that shuts down the world and we don't want 12 years to actually build a response, what would we do? Certainly the military cannot operate. That led to mRNA. So one way to think about it is there are scientific leaders and field leaders who often have a theory about what's missing. And that's a different way of sort of betting. And I actually think it's a different thing than like a selection problem, or still like a what's missing problem. And in a world in which science has become increasingly complex, having better selectors and folks who can actually identify those needs is really... The other one that I'll just sort of throw out there, which has very little to do with humans, is I think that in general, government just underfunds the development of new instruments. And like, just because I think one way to think about it is Lots of stuff, whether it's like, like how well we can observe things, microscopy and other things. A lot of that is done on the back end of like individual PI awards. It's just like a really weird way to advance. And so one of the things I always just think is like, you can take something that exists right now and make it 100 times faster, 100 times cheaper. Those programs like should exist in the government. Just like take existing capabilities and just make them a lot better. You'll get a bunch of crazy science on the other end of it. And it's never the individual job. Individual scientists are not well positioned to often say, we think we can move a capability from here to here. But at a field level, those things can be very high impact.
So I think one of the benefits of being in philanthropy is you can experiment with your own grant making. And there are a couple of examples of funders that have tried different ways of narrowing down who the grantees would be. One of the examples I will share is from Sloan Foundation. It's a recent one where they had 2-tier review process. And the interesting and really cool thing about it was that they had scientists review the first tier and came up with which are the important proposals. The second was bringing in end users. So it was the community that really commented on whether this would be an interesting project to fund. So that really brings in the end user. It builds trust among the community and brings some of the community inside the minds of scientists to understand where the science is going. And that's another way of doing science, to really bring the science to the community, bring the community inside and understand where the impacts are going to be and let the community decide where they want the science to progress. So you're still distilling whether it's good science or bad science on one tier, but on the other hand, you are bringing the community and letting the community decide whether they want the science to progress in one direction or the other. And that really builds trust in science, which is a big question right now. Another example I want to share that philanthropy has done is more about seeding fields. So one way is to bring researchers from different fields together that probably may not communicate with each other and bring them in one area. Just let them talk for a couple of days and let them come up with grant proposals in that time. Oftentimes interesting ideas emerge, and those ideas can be seed funded. That can lead to failures, but could sometimes lead to really big success, which you would not have predicted if you had gone through the typical grant review process and asking for proposals, because that field did not exist. So seeding the field and letting the researchers collaborate to come up with interesting ideas is something that philanthropy has tested and successfully proven.
Super cool. Thank you. So I've got one last question here, and then can open it up to the audience. And this one's a little like open-ended, but it seems like a lot of things are changing in the world right now. For instance, like the Nelson memo, everything's going to be open access. There's going to be open data. AIs are incredibly valuable and can understand large amounts of information very quickly. There's all kinds of these cool experiments, like trying new ways to fund science because there's this recognition that the way we're currently doing it could be improved. So I guess, like, where are we going to be in 10 years? Like, what do you guys think this is going to shake out as? Or just curious, like, what you think is going to happen?
I imagine, I think, given what the funders have been thinking about in the Alliance community, a big push is towards funding sustainable infrastructure. Data is everywhere, AI is everywhere. AI is helping science, but not all the data in science is AI ready. So making things openly accessible, machine readable, I think the future is in AI, and a lot of the science will be with AI agents. So it's important to fund long-term science in a more sustainable way that's helpful for AI to read and then also generate hypotheses to help the scientists.
I think one thing we haven't talked about is just the federal government. Science is under like this huge amount of funding pressure because of both like a bunch of the delays that happened that started off the year, but even as the catch-up has happened, I think like scientists, especially younger scientists, postdocs, feel like a deep sense of like uncertainty around what the federal picture will be. At the same time, there's also just a huge fight between the administration and universities. So just like, you're a random cancer researcher, you are like, what does my day-to-day have to do with protests on campus? but like that dynamic is constantly causing your research to get paused. So one of the questions, and this is just really a question on your 10-year outlook, is whether planned or not, I do think like the bundle of most cutting edge research science happening within the university is going to get relooked at, because I think if you're a top researcher, you could affiliate your lab with a university, but a world in which you are 100% sitting within the university, suddenly it just becomes a more complicated question, because suddenly you have to carry the political weight of everything happening outside of your lab, and that's a hard question. So I think like we don't really know, but I think the compact for a long time, coming out of the 1945 consensus was that, we wanted curiosity-led science. Universities were a great place to be hubs of that cutting edge over, and we poured a lot of resources. So most of the most deep scientific institutions sit within the university. National labs are an exception. Corporate labs are an exception. I think a world in which like the administration, like when I was coming up in politics, there was a thing called the Rumsfeld memo, which was they said, oh, if you don't let ROTC onto campus, we might like put some restriction on funding. And then that was like this huge red line, which is like under no circumstances can university funding, like we have crossed that line 100 times over in the past year. So I think from now on, I think like all funding to universities is always going to be up in question for every policy debate that's ever happened. So what is the research committee going to do? Which is like, researchers are not political animals to a large extent. Are they going to be able to navigate every one of these fights? So I think if I was to sort of say, there's lots of things that are going to happen on AI and everything else, but institutionally, one dynamic that we're going to have to now deal with is like, where should cutting edge research happen? And it might happen in affiliation with universities, but is it going to happen 100% within universities? Just like an open question.
Yeah, those are both really good answers. And I think obviously prediction intervals on all of this are very wide. Like I have no claim to know what's going to happen in 10 years. One trend that I'm cautiously excited about is I think regardless of how significant the speed up is, I think AI's potential for science has gotten a lot of actors excited about science again in a way that they haven't been as excited about its prospects in their own ecosystems for the past decade or so. So I think hopefully industry will start to play a larger role as the kind of time gap between basic and applied science maybe starts to shrink, with AI speeding up progress to things that become commercializable in 5 years rather than 20 years. And I think hopefully that could keep resourcing in science that we would currently define as kind of foundational and theory-driven. I think on like what science actually looks like, if anyone's watching this in 10 years, you can hold my feet to the fire. I mean, I hope that as AI makes certain aspects of science a little bit less prestigious, or maybe reduces the cost of kind of the writing, the hypothesis generation, it will kind of redirect some of the funding towards the hard data, not just data to train models, but data to answer questions that then you can feed into systems. And I think a broader focus on kind of prioritizing and increasing the prestige of collecting unique data sets will then also increase the prestige of creating new hardware that makes creating new data sets that other people can't collect even more prestigious. And that could create an interesting virtuous cycle where you get some of the instrumentation as more of a central focus of funders, both federal and otherwise. And I think that could be a cool thing to see.
I like the vision. I guess any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Kumar, so you raised a really interesting, I'm Jim Nasser, formerly at CDC. So you raised a really interesting kind of thread about, well, go and talk to the funders, go and talk to NSF, talk to ARPA-H, they want to hear from you. And I think that is a valid point of view. What I've found, particularly at the county and the state level, where I think there's like a significant amount of data. By the way, you guys know this, I'm sure you know, certainly for public health, the data is owned by the state or the county. It's not at the federal level. So CDC does not own any of the public health. It's at the county level. I'll give you a specific example. If you look at the opioid settlement funds, there's $50 billion in opioid settlement funds. Each state has it, is distributed. But a lot of that money is actually going to law enforcement, buying SUVs and German Shepherds and things like this. There's a lot of opportunity in like what I think of as forensic data analysis. For instance, mortality data. I'll give you an example. Right now we're working with a county in Alabama on drug paraphernalia found at opioid site of death. And the reason why we're doing that is that there's a direct correlation we can get from AI on was there fentanyl strips available? Was there Narcan available? That money is available through the prevention and treatment from opioid settlement funds. Where I'm going with this, though, is are you guys looking at engaging at a lower level? Not necessarily, I mean, honestly, I feel like at the federal level, if I to the counties, I just did yesterday, one of our big customers, they're like, Jim, we can't get to anyone. Nobody answers anything. All the money is dried up. There is no money. And I'm thinking, well, there is money in the opioid settlement funds, but there is a connector problem, which is really you guys. To accelerate, for instance, some startups to do some AI work with this data and then say, look, now use this to apply for the grants because now you have evidence that then you're actually helping prevention and treatment. So this really, my question is at a broader level, are you looking at engaging at a lower level at county and state? Because honestly, I feel like that's where they need help. And really the data is at that level.
It's a good question. I mean, one of the interesting things I think about these sort of public health questions is that I actually think there's not that many people who think the way you're thinking. So when ARPA-H got started, 2 years, almost like a year and a half in, they had 4 big tranches of work. They had tons of ideas coming in on biomedical innovation, on ideas that link to payers, where like, we want to do this research experiment so that we can drive down overall medical costs. Like very few ideas. Because in general, people do not have that many ideas on, if we implemented this intervention, we could actually cut, opioid deaths this way, and this could save the system this kind of money. And they were actually asking for those ideas. So I think in general, thinking about public health interventions that over time could pay for themselves, but like require the early investment to actually run that experiment is actually a really good thing. They put out all these calls. When I've talked to like CMS is like, hey, if there are experiments worth doing that would save the system money, we would pay for it. We don't get those ideas. So it's this weird thing where, partly because of the way NIH has run for a long time, there's a huge community that is like set with their next biomedical innovation. If you say, how many ideas are there for things that would actually save the system money while improving health outcomes? That actually is like a way smaller list, and people find it, and those ideas don't really come in. So I actually think this is a good push.
There's only one NGO philanthropy that is looking at this, and that's Bloomberg. So I'm hoping even as part of this little narrative, we can increase awareness because those are like real problems at scale. I mean, there's $50 billion over 20 years just in settlement opiate funds. That's not trivial. And honestly, I feel like there could be a number of ResearchHub projects at 100K, 150K, 200K for doing retrospective, like forensic AI work. I'll give you another use case. Hypothermia and dementia. We're working in Cleveland on this. They just need like 100,000 or 50,000 seed money. And then once you prove that theory, you could tap into opioid money that's available for 19 more years. So, we're really like a last mile issue on this one.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, ResearchHub. This is just so fascinating as a fundraiser. I work with Boston University. I'm only 3 days on the job. I was recently at Stanford Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, where one of our advisory council members said to us about 2 years ago, why focus on the one country that's pulling back on scientific funding? Go focus on the 195 other countries in the world that are happy to provide research, which led to a very interesting last year working across individuals, corporations, foundations, and governments. Singapore, Seoul, Middle East. And I was really interested, Kumar, in your comments about London. I wonder what other geographies you might be seeing that are particularly innovative from which we could learn and benefit.
It's a great question. So Renaissance is under 2 years old, but we did not start out with like a really large international plan. And as of right now, we now have active work in the UK. We have a major 3-year partnership with ARIA, which is their new R&D agency. We have a partnership with Sprind in Germany. And then we have a partnership with the Cabinet Office in Japan. And pretty active interest from a number of other countries. I think one of it is just like the U.S., despite all of its criticisms, remains like the beacon for a lot of other R&D ecosystems. They think Americans are ambitious. They think there's a lot of edge thinking. They want to tap into that. Partnering with the U.S. government right now is complicated. So like they would rather partner with players in the system. I think the second piece is that, especially with all the tumult going on, they actually think they have a fighting shot to keep their talent. And so they're like, I think US researchers are way more open in the current context to like mixed funding. I think like our sort of view is less on a poaching frame and more on it's a good time to widen out and think about research funders from multiple sources. And we focus mostly on strategic allies of the US, so it makes our lives easier. So I do think being wider is useful. Some of these countries are investing a lot more and are interested in investing more. I think one of the place where we've had the most traction has been international interest in the ARPA model. And so that's one where we're getting a ton of folks who want, because part of it is that a lot of them actually have pretty deep scientific ecosystems. It's just they are worried that they don't have good mechanisms to push their researchers to think big. Like, what is the mechanism to do that? And that's a place where they think like there's lots to learn around what is that type of ambitious goal setting.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's all the time we have right now, but thank you very much for the panel and the questions.